this video, I'm going to provide an overview of the four market structures and the characteristics within each structure. The first type of market that we have is what is often called perfect competition or pure competition. These names are most often used, and they're used interchangeably. It's important to know that this is what we call a price taker firm, sometimes called a competitive price taker firm. And a price taker firm is distinct from the other three types of markets, which is what we often call a price searcher firm. So what I want to do is first show you the difference between a price taker firm and a price searcher firm. In a perfectly competitive market, we have on the one side of the side-by-side graph the market for a particular product. Let's say it's something like corn, which is an undifferentiated product, and there's lots and lots of sellers. In the market, you have all firms, say thousands and thousands of farmers. The price is set in the market by supply and demand, the supply of all farmers and the supply of all of the consumers. The price in this case, which is $1, the market price is going to carry over to the firm. And the firm is going to face a perfectly elastic demand curve, meaning that this firm can sell all of its output at $1, but it can't sell it at anything over $1. So this particular firm, a single firm, Farmer Roy, for example, Farmer Roy could sell all of his output for $1, but if he were to try to charge more than $1, nobody would buy his output because they would simply go to another firm that is charging $1, which is why we call this the price taker firm, meaning that if you compete in this market, if you're producing in this market, you have to accept the market price and you can't charge a penny more. Now I want to contrast that with what we call a price searcher firm, which is what the other types of firms are. Now the demand curve for the three types of price searcher firms looks very different. The three types of price searcher firms are monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. When we're looking at a price searcher firm, we see that they face a downward sloping demand curve for the output of their product, meaning that as they charge a higher price, they're going to sell less quantity. But as they sell at a lower price, they're going to sell a greater quantity. For example, at $60, they're going to sell 10 units, right? So 60 times 10 is $600 in total revenue. If they were to lower the price to $40, they would sell 20 units of output. 40 times 20 is $800. If they were to lower their price even further to $20, they would have sales of 30 units of this good. So 20 times 30 is 600. You can see that depending on what price they choose, they're going to have different revenues. Now that is not to say that you want to choose the revenue maximizing price, because we know that all firms want to produce where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. They want to produce the profit maximizing price. But it is to say that as you raise and lower the price, it's going to increase or decrease the quantity. So stated a slightly different way, it matters how the firm prices its output, whereas with a price taker firm, it does not matter. Moving back to our table, let's begin going through a perfectly competitive firm, or what's often called perfect competition. It's worth noting up front that this is chapter 22 of the textbook that we're using for my class. That is the Gwartney textbook. So let's begin with the number of firms in the industry. Well, there's going to be many firms. Well, what is many? I don't know. It could be hundreds. It could be thousands. It could be 10,000. We don't know. It's many. That's the definition. So if you use the example, let's go over here to the examples first. I think the best example here is going to be agriculture. So, corn, wheat. There's an example that's given in this this worksheet, that's cucumbers. These are examples of perfectly competitive products. Other examples may include things like raw materials or commodities, so these are all examples of things that we would say are perfectly competitive. And the reason that I'm going to the examples first, I think it's most useful to think about those products. These are what we would often call similar products or identical products, even in some cases. So when we're talking about similar versus different or differentiated products, these are going to be products that are similar. And one might even say that they are actually identical. Okay. Ability to control prices, the answer is no. These firms are price takers. Meaning that they have to accept the market price. And the firm is too small as a part of the overall market output to affect the price. Ease of entering the industry. Well, what this refers to is what we often call barriers to entry. So we're going to say, first of all, that it's very easy to enter this industry. And there are, quote, no barriers. Now, it's hard to imagine no barriers, but technically that's what we say with the perfectly competitive model. Now, a barrier to entry would be something like a license, a permit, perhaps an amount of money or technical know-how in order to do something. So obviously, there's always going to be some degree of barriers to entry for any industry, but in this particular case, we're just going to say that the barriers are extremely low, if not non-existent. Existence of non-price competition. So the answer here is no, because firms do not compete on price in this particular market. So Farmer Roy, for example, is trying to sell his corn to, let's say, a customer at a Walmart or at a farmer's market, or maybe to a big supplier like Walmart. And basically, Walmart or the customer that's buying the product from Farmer Roy, they don't care that Farmer Roy grew this corn. They don't see Farmer Roy as special. They don't see him as different. They think of his corn as being corn, just like everybody else's corn. So they're not going to give a nickel more to Farmer Roy than they're going to give to somebody else. And when we think of non-price competition, normally we're talking about things like quality or advertising or branding. We don't see branding in this market. Now, to be clear, that a common criticism of the perfectly competitive market is that all that one needs to do is put a brand name on the product, and that might differentiate it to some extent. So, for example, if I were to take let's say a bottle of water and put a brand name on it like Dasani, all of a sudden we've differentiated that product. Water is water as far as most people, care. But as soon as you slap that brand name on there, people differentiate it from other bottles of water. One could easily think about slapping a brand name on corn. And of course, people do brand corn, whether it's the Spartan brand or the Walmart brand or, Dole apples or Dole bananas or whatever it might be. Those brand names do, to some extent, differentiate that product. So it's enough to say that the perfectly competitive model does face many criticisms, and often we think of the perfectly competitive model as being something that is more of a business-to-business transaction. So for example, we might think of Walmart buying produce from lots and lots of farmers, and they don't really care which farmer they're buying from as long as the good is basically the same quality and the same degree of same caliber. So for example, if we're talking about organic corn versus regular corn, we've actually just talked about a different type of product. So as long as we're talking about the same type of corn, the same grade of corn, whether it's organic or non-organic or whatever it might be, then we would just say that corn is corn. And as far as Walmart cares, they're just looking at, is it corn in the eye of the consumer? Moving on to the next type of market, we're dealing with monopolistically competitive markets, or what we often will call a competitive price searcher. In this type of market, we're going to have many firms, again, but not necessarily as many as you would have in a perfectly competitive market. I'd like to go straight to some examples because I think that helps us understand. One of the best examples here would be, let's say, a restaurant. Restaurants, ice cream, haircuts. And we could go into lots of other examples too, but these examples will suffice. So let's consider what restaurants are like. There's lots and lots of different restaurants out there. Let's take a few different examples. Applebee's, Chili's, Red Robin. There's hundreds of restaurants out there. But in many ways, these restaurants are very similar, but they're not exactly identical. So what we're going to say is that this is a differentiated market to some degree, meaning that the items that they're going to sell are going to be different. To some degree. Now, does that mean that they're totally different? Not necessarily. They might be just slightly different. You would know the difference between being at, say, Applebee's and at Red Robin or at Chili's. That's not to say that you can't buy a hamburger at both institutions. Of course you could. But in the eye of the beholder, they're different. So if you were to take somebody to one restaurant, they might have a stronger preference about going to a different restaurant. One might easily say that, a hamburger from Red Robin is just as good as a hamburger from Chili's. But if a consumer believes that the hamburger at Red Robin is better, then in their mind it's differentiated. And one of the reasons that we know this is we see things like branding, right? And so branding in advertising. So branding and advertising are signs of non-price competition. So we're going to say, yes, there is non-price competition, which is why firms advertise. They say, eat at my restaurant. Just think of examples like pizza restaurants, right? There's so many different pizza restaurants out there, yet some people have strong preferences whether or not they're going to eat whether Hungry Howie's Pizza, Pizza Hut Pizza, or maybe it's Jet's Pizza. People really care what kind of pizza they have. Now, all pizza may be very similar to some degree, but you can differentiate it, meaning you can tell the difference. Ability to control prices, the answer here is going to be yes. Now, that doesn't mean that they can raise prices as high as they want. As they raise prices, they are going to lose consumers to competition who opt for different items, different, maybe a different pizza restaurant or a different restaurant entirely. And then ease of entering the industry, we're going to just say that this is also going to be, we'll call it fairly easy. Meaning that there's what we call low barriers. Now, low barrier simply means that it's not too difficult to hop into that market. You may need to get a permit or a license, or you may need to know something about making food or making ice cream. So a low barrier is something that's very doable. Okay, so when you think of restaurants or ice cream restaurants or ice cream companies or hair salons, all of these things are very achievable. It's not going to require a ton of specialized talent and know-how to do any of these things. Now, I want to add a couple of things here. I want you to think about a product like ice cream. It's very interesting that companies like Ben & Jerry's ice cream, as compared to, say, a generic brand ice cream that you might be able to buy at your local supermarket that's, the cheapest one on the rack. People have strong preferences about what ice cream they're going to eat. If I were to have my wife ask me to go and buy some Chunky Monkey ice cream, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and I go to the store and see that, wow, Chunky Monkey ice cream is $3 for a small container at the local supermarket. But hey, look, I could get 3 of the off-brand ice creams for the same price. I could get all 3 of them. And I were to show up at home and say, hey, look, honey, I bought you 3 ice creams instead of 1. She would not be very happy. People can have very strong preferences about the different products that they might be buying, about the brands, and it may or may not actually be better. What matters is that the buyer perceives it to be better. It could be as simple as adding a logo onto a shirt. All of a sudden, you can double the price that you sell that shirt for if it's got a Nike swoosh on it or a North Face logo. You see this all the time, that people don't want to buy off-brand clothes. They don't want to buy off-brand shoes. I remember seeing a girl in a Costco one time, and her dad was saying, "Oh, look, honey, this really nice sneakers here. I think they were Fila's," and you could tell this girl wanted nothing to do with it. And she said, "Oh, no, I need to wear Nikes. These other shoes that will hurt my feet." And he's like, "Oh, they're only $25." And she's like, "Oh, no. It's pretty clear that this particular individual, she did not want to be seen wearing these, in her mind, off-brand shoes. Although Fila is a reputable brand, but it's certainly not a cool brand like, Nike or, a North Face or something like that. So it's important here to remember that in these types of markets, it's about preferences. It's not necessarily about objective differences that are better or good. I mean, if you look at McDonald's doesn't necessarily make the best hamburgers out there, but people want to buy McDonald's hamburgers for one reason or another. And so McDonald's can command a higher price for their hamburgers than you might be able to if you bought or made a hamburger that was twice as good. Because it's all in the eye of the beholder, and that's in part because of branding and advertising. Now we're going to move on to oligopoly. Now, oligopoly is defined as a few firms. Now, what is a few? Well, it could be 3. It could be 2, to be honest. It could be 20. It kind of depends. So it's not exactly clear what a few is, but what we will say about this particular market is that it is highly concentrated. At least compared to other markets. And we often hear about things like concentration ratios. Meaning, let's take, for example, I'll come back to this in a second. Let's go to a couple of examples. Let's go to the oil industry. Let's look at the auto industry. Cereal, breakfast cereal. The airline industry. Okay, so let's think about how many car companies there are out there. There may be, 10 car companies out there right now that are producing a substantial volume. Normally we think of the big ones like Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Toyota, Honda. Those are the big companies selling cars in the United States, at least. Of those 5 firms, or maybe 6 or 7 firms, depending, they might sell 80% of all of the cars sold in the United States. Then there's smaller firms out there as well that might sell a smaller percentage of the cars. Maybe a car company like Mercedes or Tesla or Jaguar. These are much smaller companies, and they don't sell a significant volume when you compare them to the likes of Toyota or Honda or Ford, right? So when we're talking about the concentration ratio, what we're asking is, or what we're pointing out, is how many firms sell what percentage of the market. In the United States, I think that 75% of the cars that are sold are sold by, I believe, 6 companies, and it's Ford, Toyota, General Motors, Chrysler, Honda, and if I'm not mistaken, it's Nissan. I could be mistaken on that, but so 6 firms sell 75% of the cars. So this puts it in the oligopoly category. You might also think of companies like soda, okay? In particular, cola, right? So how many firms are selling Coca-Cola, or cola, I should say? Well, there's a lot of firms selling cola, but there's 2 firms that sell most of the cola, and that is Pepsi and Coca-Cola. They might sell 95% of all the cola that's sold in the United States. There are smaller companies like RC Cola, Vago Cola, but they're not selling any significant volume by comparison. So the concentration ratio of soda sales is going to be very high just with those 2 firms. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we could look at this, and I think that's probably sufficient for the moment. So when we're looking at these different examples, keep in mind that when you're talking about oil, we could be talking about the gas companies that are selling gas here, or the producers, which are maybe the countries, different countries selling oil. And in this case, with the oil industry, this is a similar product, right? So it could be both similar or differentiated. In the case of oil, it's going to be similar, because oil is oil for most people. We don't care what kind of oil we have. We don't care what kind of gasoline is going in our car. It all basically is the same stuff for most people. But in other industries, like say the auto industry, these are differentiated. I'll just write different, okay? Meaning that they're not identical, right? A Ford truck is different than a Chevrolet truck or a Toyota truck, right? It doesn't mean that they're not similar in their function, but you can tell the difference between these 2 trucks, right? If you were to show me the trucks without any emblems on it, I would know that they're different. Now, everybody maybe wouldn't know, but they're certainly different. Cereal is another great example. There's maybe 3 or 4 different companies that make the vast majority of all of the breakfast cereal. Kellogg's, General Mills, that is, Post, Quaker. There may be some others, but most of the cereal is produced by probably 4 or 5 major firms. Airlines, both with the carriers and the producers. In the world, there's 2 producers for airlines for the most part. That is Airbus and Boeing, and they produce something like 95% of all of the commercial jets. Now, there's other companies out there producing jets, but it's a very small number. When you're looking at the carriers, it's actually very similar. Delta, Southwest, Spirit. There may be more carriers, but it might be 15 or 20 carriers total. There's not a ton of them. And so all of these would be considered oligopoly markets. Okay, and again, these are all in some ways different, right? With these 3, we could say that these are more different, but with oil, we're more similar, right? Or similar, and with these other 3 markets, we're talking about products that are more different. At least somebody can tell the difference between them. Ability to control prices. This is a little bit of a tricky question. So I'm going to just say yes, but this is where we get into what we call game theory. And there's what we call interdependence, meaning there's interdependence in pricing. So if Ford raises their price, if Ford lowers their price, General Motors will probably have to lower their price too, because they're direct competitors. Now, interdependence can look different for different industries, right? So if, with the example of Ford lowering their price, because General Motors was then going to want to lower their price too, so that they're not having all of their customers snatched away by Ford, There's other ways that they can handle things. They could add different warranties. If Ford adds, say, a 10-year warranty onto their truck, General Motors will probably have to follow in order to compete. There's a number of different things that we could talk about here, and this is going to be discussed further when we talk about what we call game theory. Okay, so game theory is how we discuss interdependent pricing. So there's some degree of ability to control prices here, but there's interdependence. And because of interdependence, we're often going to run into what we call collusion. And sometimes you'll end up seeing what we call a cartel. And a cartel, or collusion for that matter, what they're seeking to do is work together. Say Ford and GM say together, hey, let's both raise our prices, and then consumers will have to pay higher prices because where else are they going to go? Or, and more accurately, if Ford, GM, Chrysler, and Toyota did that for their trucks, right? Because those are the four companies that make most of the trucks in the United States. So by all four of those companies operating kind of as one to some degree, customers are going to be to some degree forced to buy their trucks at a higher price. We most often see this in the oil industry, and you often hear of the oil industry cartel referred to as OPEC. It's illegal to have a cartel in the United States, but worldwide, of course, they still do exist. All right, ease of entering the industry. This is a very difficult. Okay, so we're going to just say that it's difficult. Okay, now what does that mean? It means that there's very high barriers. Now, I want to take a moment and discuss what high barriers could look like depending on the industry. When we think of barriers to entry, barriers to entry can be many different things. And I often like to distinguish between what we would call natural barriers to entry and artificial barriers to entry. So natural barriers to entry might be very high costs, like startup costs and capital, right? You need a lot of money to start, say, an automotive firm or an airplane manufacturing facility. Those are companies that require a lot of startup capital, a lot of technological know-how, and perhaps economies of scale. It would be very difficult to suddenly start competing with a company like Ford Motor Company or General Motors, given the fact that they're producing large quantities of cars and are getting, in essence, bulk discounts or economies of scale costs, so lower per unit costs because of the volume that they're producing. So those are what we would call natural barriers to entry, right? It's very hard to just jump in and start competing with a company like Ford or maybe a company like Airbus or Boeing that have been established there for a long time. Now, that doesn't mean that it's impossible, right? Honda, for example, has started to manufacture airplanes. And so it's not like you have to start off with being somebody that is not involved in business at all. It could be some existing company that switches into a different industry. Maybe it's Google that starts producing cars. Maybe it's a company like Apple that started producing phones that never produced phones prior to producing the iPhone, right? So these competitors and these companies can sometimes come out of nowhere, and they can make a move from one industry to the other. Tesla is a more recent company that's actually pulled this off. So the other type of barriers that you'd want to know about is what we would call artificial barriers. And artificial barriers are typically what we would think of as legal barriers. That is, that there's a special license or a permit that you might have to have. So these are often, again, these are legal or laws that are in place that might prohibit people from entering that particular industry. Examples of this might include a company like Comcast that is the cable provider. You can't just start competing with Comcast. Another example might be a hospital. You can't just enter into that market. You have to have special licenses and permits. And in fact, even if you were a doctor or an insurance company, you would have to get all kinds of approvals from the government in order to start, say, a hospital and treating patients. Even if you were able to do that at an existing hospital, you can't just open up a satellite branch. And those are what we would call artificial restrictions. There's also artificial restrictions in the different industries. Take, for example, the medical profession. There are medical schools that only accept a certain number of people, and you might argue that that's to keep their supply low and their prices and wages high. That would be a cynical view, but that would be an example of an artificial barrier. Okay, so when we're talking about barriers to entry, I like to distinguish between what we would call high barriers and artificial. So in some instances, there are very high barriers to entry, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. A company like Google or Microsoft could quite easily start competing in the auto market if they chose to. It would simply be a matter of assembling some engineers and buying some equipment and facilities to start producing. Non-price competition, of course, there is advertising in branding in these markets. So the answer is yes. You see ads for auto companies, cereal companies, airlines, soda, all kinds of different companies. All right, and the final market that we're going to be talking about is what we call a monopoly, and that's in chapter 24 of your textbook. So these are all the chapters that you're going to find these topics discussed. And a monopoly is, by definition, one seller. Okay. Now, I'm going to kind of put an asterisk here because when we think of monopoly, it's not always technically one seller. It really depends on how you define the market. So just to give you a quick example, if you are Coca-Cola, one could argue that you have a monopoly on the sale of Coca-Cola. That's technically true. Do you have a monopoly on the sale of cola? Well, of course not. There's another competitor. You do have a high market concentration ratio in cola, maybe 50%, but you're not the only player in town. If you were Coca-Cola and you were being sued for being a monopoly, or maybe even being an oligopoly, too big of a firm, having too high of a market concentration ratio, Coca-Cola would probably not want to argue that they're in the sale of Coca-Cola. They would instead want to argue that they are in the market for selling, say, beverages. And when it comes to beverages, there's lots of choices. You could drink milk, you could drink water, you can drink tea, you can drink beer, you can drink wine, coffee. There's so many different choices. You don't have to be drinking soda. Now, more often what you probably see is an antitrust lawyer that's suing Coca-Cola. They might say something along the lines of, you're, a very large percentage of the soft drink market, right? Maybe it's 25%, or you are 50% or 55% of the cola market. Okay, so it really depends on how you define this market. Interestingly, the company Kellogg's, going back to oligopoly for a moment, the company Kellogg's was sued, I believe in the 1930s or 1940s, I can't remember exactly when it was, maybe it was in the 50s, for being a monopoly. And the judge threw out the case and said, I eat bacon and eggs for breakfast, and basically implying you don't have to eat cereal that is cold cereal that goes with milk. You can eat whatever you want. So yeah, maybe they have a monopoly in a sense on a particular products like cornflakes or Rice Krispies. But there are choices outside of eating Kellogg's cornflakes or Kellogg's Rice Krispies. Okay, so technically it's one seller, but it really depends on how you define the market. Are there choices outside of this one particular seller? And often the case is yes, even if it's not technically a perfect substitute. So one seller is very much something that could be kind of debated. Let's go first to some examples. And maybe before I go to the examples, I want to define what we might think of as the two types of monopolies that exist. So I like to think of two different types of monopolies, and those types of monopolies are the following. One is what we might call an efficiency monopoly or a market-based monopoly. That is a competitive monopoly that is a big firm like, say, Google or Microsoft or even Walmart or Amazon. These are very large firms. They may not technically be monopolies, but they're the biggest player on the block. And their costs are low and their quality is high because of consumer choice. They are the best producer on the market, and therefore they've effectively won the competition. So an efficiency monopoly is not a bad thing. It reflects the winner of the competitive process, the best producer. So most people like Google, they like Amazon, because Amazon and Google are a product of consumer choice. By contrast, you have what we might call a coercive monopoly. Now, a coercive monopoly is based in legal force or in law. And often the reason for a coercive monopoly is because of special privileges, subsidies, and funding from the U.S. government. And they're going to answer to regulators rather than the consumers. So examples might include things like public utilities, cable company that is, the monopoly firm in your particular area that has a monopoly on cable. Now, a lot of people might say, well, you don't have to get Comcast cable. You could get AT&T. Well, that's true, but that's technically not cable. In my area, in particular, there's only one cable company, and that's Comcast, or what they now call Xfinity. And if you want to get AT&T, that's technically phone-based internet. It's not cable. You could get, Dish Network, but again, that's satellite. That's not cable. So, when we're talking about coercive monopolies, these are all based in legal force and law rather than being based in consumer choice. Another example would be the post office. That's probably one of the most common examples. Okay. So going back to our market structures table, let's buzz through and answer some of these questions, and let's look at some of these examples. So let's use first the post office. The cable company, so let's say Comcast. Public utilities in general, like your electric company. These are often called natural monopolies. We can talk about that another time. So that's on one hand, right? But we could also talk about other types of monopolies, like, and these technically may not be monopolies, right? But we think of Microsoft, Google, Standard Oil. It was Rockefeller's company. And those companies, in this case, might have been thought of as, at least to some degree, efficiency monopolies, whereas these might be thought of as coercive monopolies, where these are efficiency monopolies. So there are differences between different types of monopolies. So let's go back to similar differentiated products. Well, technically, because you only have one choice and only one firm, this question doesn't really make sense. So how can we say similar, different? Different than what? Now, of course, it depends on how you define monopolies, and it depends on how you want to define the market, right? So if you're defining the market as being, internet service, then technically Comcast is not a monopoly because there are some competitors there. But if you want to look at them as, singularly as the sole cable provider, this question just doesn't quite make sense and doesn't quite apply to monopoly markets. Ability to control prices, and the answer is yes. Can they charge prices as high as they want? Some have made that argument, But the rule for profit maximizing is always that you produce for marginal cost is equal to your marginal revenue, which we'll discuss at another time. And so for our purposes right now, we're just going to go ahead and say that yes, they do have the degree to maximize their profits, or the ability to. But oftentimes, especially when you're dealing with these types of groups where you're dealing with coercive monopolies that are being regulated by the government, there may be some degree of regulation here for prices. And regulation is often a feature of these types of government-sponsored monopolies. Ease of entering the industry, well, this is going to be very difficult because you have restricted or high barriers. So let's go ahead and say that we have high barriers. And it's going to be very difficult / restricted. And what I mean by that is it might actually be illegal. I can't just start competing with the post office. Now you might think, well, we have UPS and FedEx, but technically they're not delivering letters to your mailbox. So they're kind of existing under a sort of a strange status that the government basically allowed them to deliver parcels or packages, but they do not deliver the mail. Only the post office is allowed, or the companies that it contracts with is allowed to put stuff in your mailbox. With public utilities, you can't just start your own electric company. You can't just start your own waterworks or drain service or something like that. So these are all restricted areas where you have to have special permission or sanction. Even with cable, right? You can't just start running cable lines to different people's homes. And sometimes the argument is made that things like public utilities are what we might call a natural monopoly. And a natural monopoly simply means that this market is going to be best served by one firm because they're going to have the lowest costs and it's the most efficient. A good example here would be, say, in a small town, you might have one newspaper. Or a store or a gas station or something like that, because the market just won't support more than one firm, and that's what a natural monopoly is. I have my doubts that public utilities couldn't actually be better if we had more competition there, but that's sort of a question for another time. Existence of non-price competition. Again, this question doesn't quite make sense, but we do see that monopoly firms do advertise. Even the post office advertises against imperfect competitors, meaning competitors who are not exactly the same, like UPS or the FedEx. So they still will advertise. Google will advertise, although Google's not really a monopoly because you do have competition, Yahoo and Bing and stuff like that. But they do have the lion's share. So you do see, yes, you see ads and you see branding in these markets. Okay, so this concludes this worksheet on the 4 market structures.